Welcome back, everyone. It feels great to be back after our winter break, ready to dive into some more fascinating cases. And today we're heading to Australia for a deep dive into a case that truly shocked the nation: the story of Katherine Knight and the murder of John Price.
This is a case that really gets under your skin, both figuratively and, well, unfortunately, literally in this case.
It's definitely not for the faint of heart. We're dealing with some intense material here, so listener discretion is advised. To start, can you give us a quick overview of Katherine Knight?
Katherine Knight became the first woman in Australia to be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder of her partner, John Price. Back in February of 2000, the case quickly gained notoriety due to the absolutely horrific nature of the crime.
From what I've read, this goes way beyond a typical murder case.
That's putting it mildly. Knight didn't just kill John Price. She skinned him, hung his skin from a meat hook, decapitated him, and attempted to cook parts of his body. There are a lot of layers to unpack here, and we're going to try to do that in a way that is both sensitive and informative.
Okay, let's unpack this. So we're going to look at what led up to this horrific act, starting with Katherine Knight's background.
Yes, I think that's essential. To understand such a brutal act, we need to delve into Knight's past. It's a past marked by significant trauma and violence, starting with her childhood. She grew up in a very dysfunctional and abusive household, with a reportedly violent alcoholic father.
I read that her mother would often share inappropriate details about her sex life with the children. That kind of environment can be incredibly damaging.
Absolutely. And on top of that, Knight herself claimed to have been sexually abused by multiple family members. Regardless of the specifics, psychiatrists studying her case acknowledge that these types of experiences, especially during childhood, can have a profound impact on an individual's development. It's heartbreaking. And it really makes you question how much her later actions were influenced by this early trauma.
The age-old nature versus nurture debate is incredibly complex. But aside from family dynamics, there are some other early signs that become quite chilling in hindsight.
Like what?
Well, even as a child, Katherine was fixated on knives. She had a collection of butcher knives that she displayed above her bed.
That's a little unnerving, to say the least.
It is, and it's even more unsettling knowing that later on. She began working at a local abattoir, basically a slaughterhouse, where she quickly excelled at boning and cutting meat.
Wow, that's quite a disturbing detail. It almost feels like foreshadowing.
It's hard not to see it that way. This early exposure to blood gore, coupled with her seeming comfort with knives, paints a very disturbing picture.
It's like a recipe for disaster waiting to happen. And from what I understand, her adult relationships were just as troubled as her childhood. Sadly, yes. Katherine Knight had a history of extreme violence in her romantic relationships, starting with her marriage to David Kellett. In fact, on their wedding night, she tried to strangle him.
On their wedding night, that's extreme, to say the least. What could possibly trigger that kind of reaction?
Apparently, she was upset that he fell asleep after having sex only 3 times. It's a bizarre and disturbing insight into her volatility and aggression.
And I assume this was just the beginning?
Unfortunately, yes. The violence in that relationship escalated. Knight attacked Kellett with a frying pan, fracturing his skull. There's also a disturbing incident where she placed their newborn baby on a train track moments before a train was due.
That's horrifying. Was the baby okay?
Thankfully, yes. A bystander intervened and saved the child.
It's just unfathomable. So what happened with Kellett? Did he stay with her?
Eventually, he fled to Queensland with another woman, but Knight didn't take it well. She tracked him down, took a young boy hostage, and threatened to kill Kellett and his mother.
Wow, so this wasn't a one-time incident. It seems like this pattern of extreme jealousy, possessiveness, and violence was recurring throughout her relationships.
You're absolutely right. And tragically, it all came to a head with John Price.
So this brings us to the heart of our deep dive, the events leading up to the murder of John Price.
John Price was aware of Knight's reputation, but he chose to believe that she could change. They began a relationship, but it wasn't long before the same pattern of behavior emerged.
Did Price ever try to get away from her?
He did. Their relationship was marked by constant arguments and Knight's violent outbursts. At one point, Price even told his coworkers that if he didn't show up to work one day, it was because Knight had killed him.
He predicted his own death. That's incredibly chilling.
It is. And sadly, his prediction proved to be accurate.
So what happened in the days leading up to the murder? Did things escalate?
Yes. In the weeks before, they had a major fight. And Price finally kicked Knight out of his house. He was done with the abuse, and he went as far as getting a restraining order against her.
So he knew he was in danger.
He clearly did, but tragically, it wasn't enough to save him.
So let's talk about that fateful night. What exactly happened?
Well, Knight had sent Price's children away for a sleepover, and Price spent the evening with neighbors, probably trying to take his mind off things. He went home around 11 p.m., and sometime later, Knight showed up.
Okay, this is where it gets really difficult to hear.
It is. What followed was a scene of unimaginable horror. While Price was sleeping, Knight attacked him with a butcher knife, stabbing him multiple times.
He must have been terrified.
Price woke up and tried to fight back, but it was too late. He almost made it to the front door, but Knight dragged him back inside and continued stabbing him until he finally collapsed and bled to death in the hallway.
This is just unbearable to even imagine.
It's a level of cruelty that's difficult to comprehend, but it gets even worse.
What could be worse than that?
After Price was dead, Knight didn't just leave his body. She proceeded to skin him, hanging his skin from a meat hook in the doorway.
Yeah.
Then she decapitated him and cooked parts of his body, preparing a meal with baked potato, pumpkin, and other vegetables. It's believed she intended to serve this gruesome meal to Price's children when they returned home.
That is just beyond horrific. I think we need to pause here for a moment. It's a lot to process.
You're right. We'll continue this deep dive in just a moment. Welcome back. I know what we've discussed so far has been incredibly disturbing, and it's hard to grapple with the sheer brutality of Katherine Knight's actions.
It really is. I feel like we need to take a step back and try to understand this from a psychological perspective. What could drive someone to such extremes?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? There's no easy answer, and it's important to remember that we're dealing with a very complex individual, but there are some potential contributing factors that we can explore.
Let's start with her childhood trauma. How much of an impact could that have had on her later actions?
Well, it's certainly a significant factor. Growing up in an environment filled with violence and abuse can have a profound impact on a child's developing brain and their understanding of healthy relationships. It can distort their perception of what's normal and acceptable behavior.
So in a sense, she might have been conditioned to see violence as a way of resolving conflict or expressing emotions.
That's certainly a possibility. It's not an excuse, of course, but it does provide some context. On top of that, the sexual abuse she allegedly experienced adds another layer of trauma. These experiences can lead to feelings of powerlessness, rage, and a desire for control, which might have manifested in her later relationships.
You mentioned earlier that she seemed to be drawn to knives, even as a child. Could that fascination be connected to her psychological state?
It's possible. For some individuals, knives can represent power control and even a perverse sense of intimacy. In Knight's case, her early exposure to knives, combined with her work at the abattoir, might have further desensitized her to violence and blood.
It's almost as if the lines between her work, her personal life, and her psychological state became blurred.
Exactly. It's a very disturbing thought. And then we have the element of revenge. It seems like many of her violent acts, particularly against her partners, were triggered by perceived betrayals or abandonment.
So there was a need for control and a desire to punish those who she felt had wronged her.
That seems to be a recurring theme in her behavior. She wanted to assert her dominance and inflict pain on those who dared to challenge her authority or leave her.
It's a terrifying and tragically predictable pattern. So let's talk about the aftermath of the murder. What happened once the police arrived at the scene?
Well, as you can imagine, the crime scene was horrific. The police found John Price's body in the condition we discussed earlier, and Knight was discovered unconscious in Price's bedroom. She had attempted suicide by overdosing on pills.
So she was trying to escape accountability for her actions.
That's one interpretation. It could also be seen as a breakdown, an inability to cope with the enormity of what she had done.
What happened next? Was she taken into custody?
Yes. After receiving medical treatment at the hospital, she was arrested and charged with murder.
Given the evidence, how did her defense team even approach this case?
Initially, they planned to use a defense of amnesia and dissociation. They argued that Knight had no memory of the crime, that she had blacked out during the attack. They even pointed to her suicide attempt as evidence of her mental instability.
So they were trying to argue that she wasn't in control of her actions at the time of the murder.
Exactly. They were trying to introduce the concept of dissociation, which is basically a mental process where a person disconnects from their thoughts, feelings, memories, or sense of self.
Did that strategy work?
No, it didn't. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, including testimony from her previous partners who detailed her long history of violence and instability. 2 psychiatrists also concluded that while Knight suffered from borderline personality disorder, she was sane at the time of the murder.
So the court found that she was fully aware of her actions and responsible for her crime.
That's right. And in a surprising turn of events, Knight actually changed her plea to guilty before the trial even began.
Why would she do that? Wouldn't it have made more sense to stick with the amnesia defense?
It's a question that has puzzled many people. Some speculate that she realized the evidence against her was just too overwhelming, that there was no chance of acquittal. Others believe that it was a desperate attempt to control the narrative to avoid having to hear the gruesome details of her crime recounted in court.
It seems like a difficult decision to understand. What was the outcome of the trial?
On November 8, 2001, Justice Barry O'Keefe sentenced Katherine Knight to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. He described her crime as cruel, vicious behavior and stated that she posed a serious threat to the security of society.
So she received the harshest possible sentence under Australian law.
She did. It was an unprecedented sentence for a woman in Australia, and it reflected the judge's belief that Knight was incapable of rehabilitation and that she posed an ongoing danger to the public.
It's a chilling thought that someone capable of such a brutal act is serving a life sentence never to be released. This entire case just sends shivers down my spine.
It's certainly a case that stays with you. And, while the murder of John Price is undoubtedly Knight's most horrific act, it wasn't her first brush with violence.
You mentioned that earlier. Can you elaborate on some of her other crimes?
Absolutely. Her relationships were consistently marred by a disturbing pattern of abuse and aggression. For example, during her relationship with David Saunders, she once slit the throat of his 2-month-old dingo puppy right in front of him.
Oh my God. That's just sickening. What could possibly be the motive for such a cruel act?
It seems to have been a twisted display of power and control, a way to instill fear in Saunders and to demonstrate the consequences if he ever crossed her or tried to leave.
It's a terrifying glimpse into her mindset. Were there other instances of violence in that relationship?
Yes, unfortunately. She also attacked Saunders with an iron and stabbed him with scissors during separate arguments. The man lived in constant fear of her volatile temper and her potential for violence.
It's a miracle he survived. And it seems like this pattern repeated itself in her other relationships as well.
You're right. With John Shillingworth, the father of her son, she displayed similar patterns of manipulation and aggression. She would fly into rages, often over seemingly insignificant matters. It's clear that violence was a deeply ingrained part of her personality.
So the murder of John Price, while the most extreme example, was tragically predictable given her history.
It was the culmination of a long and disturbing pattern of behavior. And it underscores the crucial point that we need to take all forms of domestic violence seriously. Even seemingly minor incidents can escalate into something far more dangerous.
It's a stark reminder that early intervention is vital. Recognizing the warning signs and seeking help could potentially prevent tragedies like this from happening.
I couldn't agree more. We need to create a culture where victims feel empowered to speak out and where support systems are readily available.
Well, we've certainly covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. It's been a heavy and disturbing journey, but I believe it's been a valuable one.
I agree. Sometimes facing the darkness is the only way to shed light on it and learn from it.
Well said. So before we wrap up this episode, I want to remind everyone to subscribe to the LDB Crime YouTube channel for more deep dives into true crime cases. We also love hearing from you, so please leave your comments and feedback on the episode. We appreciate your engagement.
And stay tuned for our next episode, where we'll be exploring a case that raises some very important questions about the ethics of certain therapeutic practices. We'll be diving into the death of Candace Newmaker.
That's definitely a case that warrants a deeper look. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.